All right, good evening, everybody. We are going to get started with our penultimate lesson. I just love using that word. I don't know, it's not ultimate. Everybody thinks it means ultimate. It doesn't. Penultimate, second to last. I don't know why there's a word for that, but there is. So as long as there's a word for it, I think we owe it to the word to use it in conversation from time to time, right? You know, somebody went through the effort of creating that word.
Limitations on that.
All right, so thank you very much for coming here this evening. We are talking about, again, the how-to guide to sharing your faith. And for the past 2 weeks, we've been working our way through what's called the Columbo Tactic. We're going to wrap that up tonight, specifically the Columbo Tactic, but giving a quick, or not so quick, recap. This happened like a couple weeks ago too, didn't it? Let's see. And then if I do, I can't see what I'm doing here. There we go. And then we'll see if it works from this point on. Now is it going to work? See, now it's going to work. It just didn't want to come off that first slide. So anyway, a quick recap so you know where we're at in talking about the Columbo Tactic. We said this was named after Detective Columbo because of his propensity for asking questions, right? He's, just one more question, just one more question. And we said it's a habit he had, and it's a habit we should have as well. So we specifically in the first week talked about one Columbo question, one first question that we can have that can help us kind of get into a conversation. When somebody says something, opens a door, and yes, folks, you live in a fallen world, people will say things that open doors. You just need to be listening, okay? The first thing you do is you ask some type of question called along the lines of, what do you mean by that? It's the clarification question, right? First and foremost, it helps make sure you know what the other person is really saying, because you wouldn't want somebody to misrepresent you, so you should not be misrepresenting them, okay? We're Christians. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard in that regard. Be true, be honest. And for that reason, we want to make sure that we're asking this question in a genuine manner, like we're genuinely interested. We're asking a legitimate question because we really are interested in what they have to say. Now, the other function that this type of question serves is lots of times they don't know what they mean by that, okay? You may be the first person asking them to clarify because all they're doing is repeating something that they heard on the internet that they thought sounded good and supported their view. So it, number one, helps you make sure you understand what they're saying, and lots of times it helps them think about for the first time what they're actually saying and see if they can actually explain it more thoroughly in more detail. The second Columbo question we talked about last week is, or not last week, 2 weeks ago, I'll just say last class, how's that, was how did you come to that conclusion? Or some variation of how did you come to that conclusion? We talked about how people love to make what I call just so statements. You know, they just say these things matter of fact as if everybody knows them to be true. And of course they're not. They've never, because they just assume that everybody's going to agree with them, they've never actually stopped to think through whether or not that statement has any solid grounding to it, whether it can be supported or not. Again, most of the time, people have not arrived at a conclusion. Most of our opinions, I hate to break it to you, that people hold today are held emotionally. They're held purely emotionally. They're held because it's something we want to be true. Maybe it's because we want to fit in to a particular friends group, or maybe it's because, we don't want to acknowledge that we're doing something wrong, you know? And so we create these beliefs based on what we want to be true, and as a result, we've never really thought through whether they actually are true. So again, the point of the second question is to see if they can actually articulate a reason why they made that statement, to support that statement. Lots of times they can't. Sometimes they will give you a reason, all right? But you don't know until you ask that question. And then I said, when they're answering you, what should be going through your mind are two questions about their reasoning. Number one, is what they're saying possible? And number two, is what they're saying plausible? All right? Meaning, is it likely to be, even if it's theoretically possible, if it's never going to happen in a million years, it's not necessarily something that's reasonable in that regard. Those two all right? We talked about how the fact that you don't need to know anything to do that, do you? I mean, you're just asking questions and letting them do all the work. You are in control of the conversation. Well, the third use of Columbo that we're going to talk about tonight is you're still going to stay in the driver's seat, all right? But as we'll see, it does require you to maybe know a little something, which we'll talk about in a minute. And these two questions I said at the bottom, is it possible and is it plausible that you're thinking about while they're answering Columbo question 2, those are going to help set you up and make you prepared for the use of Columbo number 3, which is using questions to make a point, all right? You can use questions to kind of direct the conversation toward a particular direction where you want it to go. This has distinct advantages, and one of the biggest advantages that I have found is that, and I think I've mentioned this in the class before, people don't like to be preached at, all right? If you get up there and you just tell them what you think, their minds shut down. All they're doing is they're listening for when they can interject, what can they object to, what can they disagree with. But if they're the ones doing the thinking and they come to these conclusions themselves, then they're going to be more likely to accept them because as far as they're concerned, they're the ones that thought this thing up, right? They weren't told it by you, they came to this conclusion themselves. And so using questions to guide the conversation so that they come to those conclusions themselves can be very helpful. There is another, in legal lingo, there's a way that a thing we call this, and it's called leading questions, right? Leading questions. A leading question is one that suggests an answer in it. All right, it kind of has the answer kind of implicit in the question itself. I think I gave an example, a joking example, a few classes ago at some point, where I said, you asked the question, does your mother know that you cheated on the test? You know, if you say yes, then you cheated and your mother knows. If you say no, you still cheated, your mother just doesn't know, all right? That's a joking example of a leading question in the sense that it implies an answer of some sort in it. But I want to give you a real example. In the courtroom, just so you know, if those of you didn't know, I'm a lawyer. And these aren't the pictures from the case I had, but I'm illustrating a real jury trial that I did years and years ago. In a courtroom, I'm allowed as a lawyer to use leading questions when I'm cross-examining a witness. In other words, if I call a witness, I'm the one that put that witness on the stand in the first place, I can't use leading questions. My questions have to be open-ended. Why? Because they're my witness. Theoretically, I should have prepared them ahead of time, right? Whereas if I'm cross-examining a witness that the other party has put on the stand, now I'm allowed to use leading questions, all right, to really get to them. And where I would use leading questions a lot is when I was cross-examining doctors. You know, that's the best time to do it. This was, again, an illustration from a real case that I had where my client was saying that they had a herniated disc, which if you don't know, quick anatomy lesson, this right here is an X-ray, this is an MRI. We'll talk a little bit about the differences in a minute. I mean, basically, the X-ray shows bone, whereas the MRI can show bone and soft tissue. So in between the bones of your spine, you know, these are your vertebrae, all right? This is your sacrum down here. So this bone we call S1, L5, L4, L3, L2, L1. This is your lumbar spine. And so each one of these vertebrae we give a number to, all right? And then in between each vertebrae are discs, all right? And think of them almost like shock absorbers or I just describe them as like jelly donuts, you know, where they have the covering and then they have this gelatinous goo inside. So that's the layman's way of describing it, right? But they're kind of like shock absorbers in between your vertebrae, in between the bones. Well, on the MRI, I can see the bone and I can see the disc. It shows the soft tissue. You'll notice on the X-ray, you can see the bone, but it's just this black space in between. You don't actually see the disc, all right? Well, my client's doctor said that they had a disc injury, which was impinging on a nerve, and that was causing the pain they were having. But the only evidence they had, in large part because the insurance companies sometimes control what you get, all right, was an X-ray. This was all they had. So they didn't have this. And so their doctor took the stand and said, you cannot say this person has an injury to a disc because you can't see the discs on an X-ray. All right, this is where I had fun. All right. I said something along the lines of this. Okay, so doctor, it's true that, it's true, isn't it true, doctor? Yeah, an X-ray shows bone, doesn't show the soft tissue, but the MRI shows the soft tissue. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And in a healthy spine, doctor, correct me if I'm wrong, but the discs kind of act as cushions or shock absorbers in between those vertebrae bones. Isn't that right? Yes, that's right. Well, okay, and if the disc is healthy, then it's going to be a certain thickness, and if something comes out, if you have an injury to that disc, and some stuff can come out of it, well, that disc, kind of like flattening a pillow, can become more flat, right? Yeah, that's correct. That's fair. And so if that happens, if you got a healthy disc and it's your fully flat pillow, then it's going to be keeping a certain space in between these bones. Isn't that right, doctor? Yes, that's right. And if you have a disc injury, then that pillow can become flattened, and as a result, the space in between those two bones can become narrower than it would in a healthy individual. Isn't that right? Yes, that's true. Stop right there, because I don't need to ask that doctor any more questions. Now I save it for closing argument. Guess what my client's x-ray showed? I couldn't see the discs, but I could see the space in between the bones. And this, where my doctor was saying the injury had occurred at that level, the space in between the bones was significantly narrower than it would be in a healthy individual. Verdict in my favor, I won. So, but that's what you do with leading questions, right? I was not rude, but I was very pointed with the doctor, and it's more of a, isn't it true that type of question. That's a leading type of question. You can do the same thing in any kind of conversation, but there are different ways of doing it, depending on your circumstances. First of all, understand our scriptural mandate here. I've got on the screen Matthew 10:16. This is Jesus sending out his disciples, all right? And he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. So Jesus was telling them when they're going out to preach the gospel, they need to be shrewd, but they also need to be innocent. All right? You need to be wise, in other words, but you also need to have that demeanor, that manner of being an ambassador. You need to be polite. You need to be respectful. So there's two different tones I can have in a conversation if I'm using these leading questions. All right? One, let's say I'm talking to someone and it is a genuine conversation. I've got someone who's generally interacting with me about Christianity, about Christian faith. Maybe I can sense they really want to find an answer out. All right. If I'm having a conversation with that person, I can still ask leading questions, but I'm going to ask them in a very deferential, very humble tone. I will even say things like, I'm confused by this. Could you explain this to me a little bit more? Or, I could be wrong about this, but this is what it seems like to me. You always want to make sure, because it's true, right? We're not perfect. We could always be wrong. You always want to be clear when you're having these conversations, even when you're trying to guide it a certain way, that I'm willing to listen to you. I'm willing to let you correct me on this, all right? I'm just letting you know that this is how I'm seeing it right now. So explain to me where I've got this wrong, kind of thing, all right? That's not every conversation. Sometimes I'm in a conversation, heck, maybe it's a formal debate, all right? Pretend I'm at a university and I'm on stage and I'm debating an atheist who's standing at the lectern opposite me. Am I ever going to convince that person I'm debating with? No. I'm not worried about trying to be deferential and humble and all this kind of thing. Oh, well, explain this to me to them. Who's my real audience in that circumstance? Yeah, everybody who's out there listening to me, right? Now, in that situation, I still use leading questions. I'm still going to be polite. There's never an excuse for being rude, all right? Although I will tell you, most atheists that I've seen get in debates, they do get rude and they try to get the laughs and blah, blah, blah. Won't go into that. We are not to do that. But I'm going to be more matter of fact. I'm going to be more like I was with that doctor on the witness stand in that situation than I would be in a personal conversation with someone. And it's not just a debate. It can be, there are times when someone comes up to you and they're just so abrasive and they're just attack, but there's a crowd around me. In that situation, you've got to be perceptive enough to realize this person isn't interested in my answers, but all of them may be. All right, and so it's just like a debate scenario where now I'm not so much worried about this individual person as I am everybody who's listening in. All right, so it's subtle, but there's a difference. If you hear me using leading questions in a conversation, if I'm just having a one-on-one personal conversation with someone, it's going to sound more like a personal conversation, not a cross-examination. If I'm in a debate situation, it's going to sound more like a cross-examination. All right. All right. This is kind of what I was getting at briefly at the beginning. There is a difference between the uses of Columbo 1 and 2, the first and second uses, and this third use. With Columbo 1 and 2, all right, you didn't need to know anything, not a darn thing. You could walk into any conversation and it's very easy to ask someone else what they think, which is all you're doing. With the third use of Columbo, you do need to at least know something. At a minimum, if you're going to use questions to lead the conversation in a certain way, you got to know where you're trying to lead it to, right? You've got to know what the objective is. And that's why you need to be thinking of those two questions before. Is it possible? Is it plausible? Because that's going to help you formulate where you think this conversation needs to go, which will help you create these questions and know to ask the right kind of questions. It's also helpful, as some of the examples we'll see, there's going to be times where you need to have some other knowledge. You just need to have some other knowledge. But remember, this is what we talked about before. If you don't have it, what is always an acceptable answer? I don't know. Is always an acceptable answer. Don't ever let that prevent you from getting out and talking to people about your faith. All right? And so, you know what? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Let me look into that, and I'll get back to you. Perfectly fine. You're never going to know, and you're not going to learn until you get out and start talking to people and see what types of things they're asking you and what types of things they're bringing up. All right? So you do probably need to know a little bit more. All right. Putting your cards on the table. Has anybody ever heard the phrase, you put your cards on the table? What's it mean? You lay it all out there. All right? It's just like when you're playing a card game. Normally we're sitting there, we're holding our cards close to our chest so you can't see what cards I've got. If I lay my cards on the table, everybody can see what my hand is. All right? What would happen, and that's just speaking metaphorically now, if we're having a conversation with someone and we just start out by doing all the talking and we just lay all our cards on the table. You decide that you want the conversation to go in this particular direction, but you decide to ignore my advice, and instead of asking the other person questions, you just do all the talking and you lay your cards out there. What's going to happen?
They're going to take over the conversation, and you don't have a chance.
You don't have a chance. I mean, what do you think that other person is thinking? What's going through their mind while you're giving your explanation?
They're thinking about it. They're just hearing wah, wah, wah.
They're hearing wah, wah, wah. They might, lots of times what they'll do is they'll latch on to one of the first things you say. They're looking for something to disagree with you about, all right? They're going to latch on to the first thing you say, and from that point, they're not listening to anything else. They're just waiting for an opportunity, and some of them will be more bullish about it than others. They might just interrupt you, right? And they're going to interject their disagreement. If you're talking, they're looking for something to disagree with. The trick to and the advantage to this third use of Columbo is you're not the one. It's still your cards that are being put on the table. In other words, they still want you to put down, but you're not the one laying them down. You are getting the other person to lay the cards on the table. Because if they're the ones that put them there, they're going to have a whole lot harder time disagreeing with them, aren't they? And trying to pick them up later on. So if you get them to make the points that you want to make, then they're going to be more committed to them. All right? They're not going to be able to disagree with them so much. All right, an example, this is from Greg Koukl, the guy who wrote the book that we're basing this on, right? He talked about an interaction he had at a book signing with an attorney, all right? And this attorney was basically telling him, look, I lead a good life, I'm a good person, I don't think I need Jesus. All right, that was the premise of the conversation. And this is kind of a summary of the conversation between them and how it went. So Greg Koukl talks to this attorney. He says, well, do you think people who commit moral crimes ought to be punished? He asked him a question, right? He didn't say people who commit moral crimes deserve punishment for them. He asked him, do you think people who commit moral crimes deserve punishment? And then he got lucky. He didn't know the guy was an attorney at the time. And the answer he got was, well, since I'm a prosecuting attorney, I guess I do. You don't always get lucky, but he got lucky in this conversation. This guy's a prosecutor. So, of course, he's got to say that people deserve to be punished, right? Greg Koukl says, good, so do I. Second question, have you committed any moral crimes? And the attorney says, yes, I guess I have. Greg Koukl, so have I. But that puts us in a tight spot, doesn't it? We both believe people who do bad things should be punished, and we both have done bad things. And he goes on to say, you know what I call that? I call that bad news. But you see, now that then opened the door for him to say, to preach the gospel. Say, here's what I think. You asked why you need Jesus. Here's why. Because Jesus paid that punishment that we deserve. But what's that? We need a savior, exactly. But you see, because he used questions, he got the attorney to put these two cards on the table for him. Okay? That's why we use questions. If you tell someone they're a sinner, they're going to disagree with you. If you get them to realize and admit they're a sinner on their own, they're committed to it. And they're going to be more willing to accept it. All right? All right, and I'm giving you another example here where Jesus also got someone to lay their cards on the table. And I'm sure you've probably heard this story from Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words, to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, and here's the part where they just go, they don't mean any of this, folks. If you don't, this is all sarcasm, okay? They're setting him up. They're setting him up because there's a huge crowd watching, right? Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. I mean, that alone, you know they don't mean that, right? You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? You see the trap they're laying for him. People don't like the Romans. They think a lot of the Jewish people thought that because the Romans were oppressing the Jews, to pay the tax to the Romans was to participate, to fund the oppression of the Jews. All right? But if he says not to pay your taxes, they could have him charged with sedition and get him hauled off and arrested. They're thinking win-win situation, right? Jesus gets them to lay the card on the table that he wants to lay. All right? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius. And he asked them, didn't tell them, asked them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. He's already won. He's already won. He got them to put the card on the table. They can't try to weasel out of this now because they admitted it, right? Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed because they were astonished how stupid they were. No, so they left him and went away, right? You can see how this strategy works to try to get them to lay the cards on the table. I'm going to give you two other illustrations here. One, a hypothetical that I actually raised, I think, last week, and we're going to see it play out in more detail now. And then I'm going to replay a real conversation that I had with someone in real life. The one that I brought up last week was, remember, the Islamic view that the Bible has been corrupted. Because they admit, the Quran says that there's people of the book and that the gospel, all right, and even the Old Testament book, those are divinely the revelation of God, all right? The problem then, of course, comes up when you realize, well, wait a minute, but there's things in the Gospels that contradict what's in the Quran. So how do you reconcile that? And while the Quran itself doesn't say this, this is kind of the way that modern Islam has tried to resolve the issue. They say, well, when the original revelation was correct, and if you look back at the original revelation that God gave, it would agree with the Quran completely. But those nasty Christians got a hold of everything, and they changed it. They corrupted the scriptures, all right? So I want to show you how this Columbo tactic would play out in this type of conversation. So the claim was made that, well, while the Bible was God's revelation, it was corrupted by the early Christian church. So any times when it comes into conflict with the Quran is the higher authority. To which we do our first Columbo question, right? What do you mean by the Bible was corrupted? What do you mean by that, right? Clarify, make sure you understand what they mean, and make sure they know what they mean. So the answer you're going to get is, well, the Christian church had access to the copies, so they changed them. All right? Okay. Next question. Remember, how did you come to that conclusion? So how did you come to that conclusion? Or what evidence do you have that you looked at that shows that these texts have actually been changed? All right, at that point, the conversation most of these times is going to be over, or they're just going to try to Hamana, hamna, hem, and ha, because there is no evidence. And Muslims don't actually point to any particular evidence that the Bible's been corrupted, because there is no evidence that the Bible's been corrupted. I mean, we have very, very old copies, and it's consistent by and large throughout. But let's pretend they had an answer for you. All right? They came up with some way that they think showed that the Bible was corrupted. You don't have to say all this. This is a whole bunch of different options, okay? There's a lot of different things you could ask as that third Columbo question, all right? Leading questions. Well, Christians didn't really have access to the Jewish scriptures, did they? All right? And even if we assume they did get them, if you don't know all this, the Christian church was persona non grata for the longest time until the Edict of Milan, I think it was the Edict of Milan, in 313 AD, finally recognized it as an official religion, and it got acceptance. And then from that point on, it did gain political power, but it didn't have it before then. All right?
In Milan, I read that document in Latin.
Did you? Yeah.
I read the original of that document in Milan by Emperor Constantine, but I think it was 325 AD.
325 is when when Constantine made it an official religion of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
313 is when they originally said it's not a forbidden religion. In other words, you were allowed, it was criminal to be Christian. And so it was 313 when it wasn't anymore, and then eventually got even more power, right. But you could ask any number of questions like, so how exactly did the Christian church know where to find all of these copies that have been accumulating for the past several hundred years? How did they track them down? Or do you have any idea the sheer number of copies that there were? I'm curious, how many copies were there that they had to get? Was it even possible or practical for them to actually gather all these up and make all these changes? I'm curious, what was the mechanism where they actually were able to do that? Because, if you know how many copies there were and how long afterwards this was, again, these things weren't like stored on a hard drive somewhere. It's not like you could pull it up in Microsoft Word and just make all the changes, right? You had to literally find, in order for their claim to be true, all the physical copies that had been spread all around the world and change all of them. And by the way, none of our earliest copies show evidence that they were changed. If they were changed, then you'd expect to have a whole bunch of, this whole paragraph being marked out, and it's just not there, all right? So these are examples of some leading questions, but you can see where in order to ask these, you would have to have some level of knowledge of the subject, wouldn't you? You'd have to know that. So how do you get that? Well, once you go out and engage, if you didn't have that knowledge, then that's the time when you say, you know what, I don't know, that's a good point, let me come back to you. And then you go back and you research it, and now you find out all this stuff, so now you're prepared the next time it comes up. All right. This is a real conversation, all right? Somewhat paraphrased, because this was several years ago, all right, that I had with someone who was an advocate of transgenderism, all right? And so I'm going to actually I'm going to illustrate this entire conversation. I have actually a pre-filmed conversation partner on the screen, so you can actually see it like a dialogue, all right? And you'll see how, was I perfect? No, obviously not. But how I was trying to use leading questions to guide the conversation in a certain direction, to point out an error that I thought this person was making. All right? Let me get one last swig of water here before I start talking more. I think you'll all really, this person that I got to film this is one that I engage with and talk about. They do me a lot of favors. I talk to them an awful lot. Some of the best conversations I've had in my life have been with this individual. You know what? It's a budget, folks. You got to take what you got. I got me. All right. So let me get my script here going on. Oh, I'm not in the right place. Here we go. All right. So this individual is going to begin the conversation. Here we go.
Biological sex and gender are two completely different things. Biological sex is our biology, whether we're born with XX or XY chromosomes, the type of reproductive organs we have, things like that. But gender is a social construct. See, society places certain roles on people based on their biological sex, but not everyone identifies with the roles that match their sex. So their gender is a way of expressing where they fit in those cultural norms.
You know what? I can agree with a lot of what you said there, but what do you think the solution is?
We need to affirm them in their gender identities.
Just out of curiosity, would that include things like surgery, even for children, or puberty blockers, for example?
Absolutely. First, you should know that the effects of puberty blockers are completely reversible if the child changes their mind when they get older. When children start to go through puberty, they develop the physical characteristics of a gender they don't identify with, and that can cause them emotional trauma.
The statement about them being completely reversible is 100% false, but I let that one go for right now to keep the conversation moving where I wanted it to go. All right. Now wait a minute here. I'm confused for a second. I thought you said gender was a social construct.
It is.
Well, you just said that when they go through puberty, they start developing physical characteristics of a gender they don't identify with. How can a social construct have physical characteristics?
Well, I mean that as they go through puberty, they get physical attributes that remind them of being male or female. But since that's not how they identify, it causes them trauma.
But I thought you said gender and biological sex are two completely different things.
They are.
And that our sex organs are part of what's meant by biological sex.
That's right.
But then you said that the sex organs correspond to a gender they don't identify with.
They don't.
So is gender social or biological?
Social.
Is it something people are born with?
Yes.
I'm sorry, but it seems to me like you're playing kind of fast and loose with your definition of gender. How can someone be born with a social construct?
People are born with a gender that doesn't necessarily line up with their biological sex.
Well, that doesn't really answer my question. You say gender is just a social construct. It has nothing to do with biology. But then you say there are biological characteristics that are tied to particular genders. You start out by saying the issue is social, but then you claim it's biological. So in one breath you talk about gender like it's just something social, but in the next you talk about it like it's biological. It seems to me like you're just flip-flopping back and forth, speaking of gender as either social or biological, depending on whichever one is more convenient for your argument at that moment. Can you explain that to me?
Well, that's just the way we talk about these things for convenience.
And that was really how the person ended the conversation. Yeah. That's just the way we talk about these things for convenience. That's also an example of, understand when I say you're going to get crickets chirping or something like that, they won't have an answer. No, lots of times they'll have an answer. The answer just doesn't make any sense and kind of completely dodges what the issue was, because they're having this kind of cognitive dissonance where they don't want to recognize that they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth, okay? So that was, and again, this is not word for word, this was several years ago, but it was my best recollection of trying to create, the one thing I do remember was that last line, that sits with you, no, we just talk about these things for convenience. All right, so those are some illustrations of how you can use questions to guide a conversation in a particular direction that you want it to go. This is a reminder from 2 classes ago, all right, when we talked about the 3 skills of a good ambassador. And I'm bringing up this reminder for a reason. I'll show you why in a second. But we talked about as being an ambassador of Christ. Number 1, that means you need to have the knowledge necessary for the task. Meaning you have to know the gospel or have some knowledge of how to respond that can be helpful in certain situations, right? Number 2, you have to have the wisdom to temper our knowledge so we act more like an ambassador and less like a warrior. A lot of people actually take issue with the song Onward Christian Soldiers because they think it creates too much of a warrior type mentality as opposed to an ambassador type mentality. And number 3, you have to have a character that is consistent with the message you are communicating. If people see you not practicing what you preach, you will undermine the message. And what we talked about in week 1 was that by and large, what we're talking about here with tactics, all right, focused on number 2. It's the wisdom part. As you're starting to see, hopefully, in order to effectively use Columbo number 3, you also need to have some of number 1. All right, so Columbo number 3 kind of incorporates both of these. These also give you just to give you some examples, Greg Koukl, when he had that conversation with the lawyer, he obviously had to know not only that Jesus was the only way to salvation, right? He had to know why Jesus was the only way to salvation. Even though he wasn't doing the talking himself, he had to be able to. This is how you can kind of also practice some with yourself, is You need to be able to explain, for example, in that example, why is Jesus the only way to salvation? All right? And then if you can explain it, then that can help you formulate the questions you need to help guide someone along that path. But he had to have that knowledge. Same thing with my conversation with a transgenderism advocate. I did not go into that conversation cold, okay? I had numerous conversations over the years prior to that one, so I knew that part and parcel of this position is they kind of play fast and loose between is it biological or is it social. They'll tell you in one breath that, I think we covered this in the class on transgenderism, that the issue is completely social constructs, where meaning that society puts pressures on people to conform to certain norms that people don't identify with, but then they'll tell you the solution is to change their body to fit the societal norm. Well, if the problem is a social one to begin with, isn't the solution social? Why aren't we saying that, okay, if society's telling men that they can't bake cakes, all right, why aren't we trying to attack that norm and say, no, it's okay for men to bake cakes? All right? If society's telling women they can't do auto repairs, why aren't we trying to attack that social norm and say, no, support women and saying they can do auto repairs? But instead, what the transgender argument says is if society says a woman shouldn't be able to do auto repairs, and we have a woman who likes doing auto repairs, that she should physically change her body to look like a man, basically surrendering to the cultural norm that they said was the problem in the first place. If the problem is social, why is the solution biological? That's what I mean by they kind of play fast and loose with the two. All right. So, we need to be able to grow, right? We need to be able to learn and get that knowledge. How do you do that? Obviously, coming to Bible studies and things like this is one way. 1 Peter 3:15 and 16 tells us that we need to do this, right? But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. That's our personal spiritual state, right? Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. That's that ambassador stuff we were talking about, right? Keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Let me say that I changed this scripture a little bit, and now we're talking about running a marathon. And I say, in your heart, you should desire to run that marathon. And be prepared to run that marathon whenever a good one comes up on the calendar that you're going to be able to make it to. All right, what does that mean to be prepared to run the marathon? How would you take that instruction? What would you do? Train? Yeah. Are you acquire some knowledge about what you need to eat and how to exercise? Are you just going to sit back and say, oh, I've got the desire to run the marathon, and think that once a marathon comes up, you're going to be able to go out and run it? No, of course not. That's what prepare means, doesn't it? It means we need to be preparing to have these conversations about our faith with people. So how do you prepare to have these conversations with people? Number one, practice beforehand. I mean, one thing that we're hopefully seeing tonight and throughout this class is you've seen some of the arguments people raise. All right, so you can actually anticipate answers and responses. Say, okay, if I have someone that says X, Y, or Z to me, how would I respond to that? And then you'll say, I don't know, and you're going to send an email to Ken. Hey, Ken, how would I respond to this? Yeah, and I'll get back to you in a couple weeks, maybe. I'm busy. But seriously, you can actually act this out ahead of time, all right? Is that good enough? There wouldn't be step 2 and 3 if the answer was yes. So let me ask that again. Is that good enough? No. The best way to learn, look, you're never going to anticipate everything, all right? I went out, like I said, I started getting into Christian apologetics back in about 1998 when I was a lawyer, still am, but I'd just become a lawyer, got out of law school, and of course they teach you to cross-examine everything, right? Question everything. And so I went to my pastor at the time, and I said, I want resources about investigating how Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus. I've been hearing all my life that Jesus fulfilled all these Old Testament prophecies. Dag nabbit, now I'm a lawyer. I want to see it for myself. And that was the beginning of my journey. I started investigating that. And let me tell you, I got a little big for my britches right away. I thought, oh, this is simple. And I decided, I frankly thought I knew more than I did. And I went out and I started engaging. And I got it handed to me a few times, right? Does that mean I shouldn't have gone out and engaged? No, because I learned something through that. And then I investigated further. I mean, case in point. And you go out and I would have discussions and debates with people, and they would come up and they would tell me, Ken, I know you're sitting here, your whole argument about Jesus being resurrected hinges on the fact that he was buried in a tomb, so they could tell that the tomb was empty. But that's ridiculous, because he was crucified. And the Romans at the time didn't allow crucifixion victims to be buried. They left their bodies hanging on the cross to rot and get eaten by the birds to set an example for other people, so they would not want to be fearing crucifixion. That was part of what crucifixion was all about. First time I heard that, did I have an answer for it? No. So what do you say? I don't know that, and you just kind of bow out. I probably didn't do it as gracefully back then as I should have. And then you go back and investigate it, and you start to realize, yeah, that was the general rule. But there are Jewish historians, all right, I think it was Josephus, who there's all these writings that say, but they made an exception for the Jews. Why? Because keep in mind, the Romans also didn't want an uprising. All right, they wanted to keep it under control. And the Jews thought that anybody who died on a tree, and they considered dying on a cross, dying on a tree, to be under a curse. And if you left a body unburied, that actually defiled the land. And to them, this was the Holy Land, so that was an egregious thing. And so they took that very seriously. And so while, yes, there's plenty of historical documentation that shows that, yes, while the Romans generally left the bodies in the cross, they didn't if they were Jewish victims. They allowed the Jews to take the bodies down and bury them so they wouldn't defile the land, because if they didn't do that, they'd have an uprising on their hands. All right? And so and it's funny because this came around again, and about 5-6 years ago, I was having an online conversation with another atheist who brought this argument up. And then I gave him chapter and verse. I provided him with the historical documents to show that there was an exception made for Jews. And it's one of the only times this ever happens. I had an atheist say, you know what? You're right. I'm not using that argument anymore. And then a few years later, I talked to him. He decided, I'm going to go back to using that argument again. So whatever. But at least temporarily, it worked. But I wouldn't have known that had I not gone out there engaged. All right. So yes, you can practice ahead of time. You can try to anticipate. But you have to actually talk to people about your faith and not be afraid if you don't know the answer. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Today I was thinking about that as well. When Joseph the Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate to get the body of Jesus, if he actually paid him a lot of money for the body, or he just got the body for free, because I was thinking about that matter.
Right.
So, and then remember, he couldn't really bury him right away, since he died in the night hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So he couldn't bury him to 6 p.m., which caught him, he buried him after 6 p.m., which was already on the next day, which is High Shabbat, unleavened bread. It was the next holiday on the menorah tree, the second one. So he was buried on the 15th day of Nisan, which is the second holiday on the menorah tree. Because he couldn't bury him, he was rushing to bury him before 6 p.m.
He was right.
It will be not on the next holiday, which is High Shabbat.
Well, my understanding, they did bury him before sundown for that very reason, because it was the Sabbath that was coming. And so they wouldn't be able to, that was what happened. So they had to, that's why Joseph of Arimathea went and said, can I have the body? They were rushing to get him buried and get him in the tomb before sundown, because once sundown hit, it was the Sabbath. They're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, and so they didn't do it, which is also why then the women did not come to put the spices on him until, what we would call Sunday morning, because they couldn't do that on the Sabbath, because that would be working on the Sabbath. And so they had to wait until after the Sabbath was over before they can come to put the spices on him.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying there, but I still think, don't you think 6 p.m. actually, because the sundown is always changing.
Right, but you're right, we generally say 6 p.m.-ish, right.
They set at 6 p.m. To be actually the next day, starting from 6 p.m. because it's the first hour in the morning is 6 a.m. And the last hour, of the day, it's the 12th hour, is 6 p.m. So it's starting like the new day, the night start.
Yeah, but that's why he was buried before the official, because remember we say that Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, right? Which was also just a linguistic thing they talked about for 3 days. It didn't need to necessarily mean the entirety of 3 days. It just meant he was in for part of those 3 days. So that first day, he was buried before sundown because that's the first day that he counts. So he was in for part of that first day. And then the entirety of the next day he was in from sundown to sundown, essentially what we would call 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday. That would be day 2. And then he was still in there from 6 p.m. Saturday until Sunday morning, which would be day 3. So he may have only been in the tomb for 5 minutes before 6. It doesn't matter. And I don't think the Bible says what time they got him in there. But he was in before 6 to make it 3 days. Yeah.
I was reading the account of Luke, because I guess I happened to be reading
Right, yeah.
my devotions. And it talks about Joseph of Arimathea being a member of the council, and he didn't agree with what was happening. When he went to Pilate, it doesn't say that he waited till Jesus died. He might have went to Pilate while he was.
That's true. He might have been, Jesus, we don't know when he went to Pilate. Obviously, he didn't take the body. They didn't get the body until Jesus was
But then
dead.
it says, then he took it down and wrapped it, so I think he already had permission.
Yeah, I mean, he had to have had permission before they went and took the body down, obviously. How far ahead of time? It doesn't give a
He
time.
did it after Jesus died because the centurion confirmed that he was dead.
Yes, as far as them taking the body down. Look, and here's the thing, and this is, again, another side note. Another thing that a lot of atheists like to say, mostly internet atheists, you're not going to find scholars that propose this theory because it is this ridiculous. It's what's come to be known as like the swoon theory, where people will try to say that Jesus didn't really die. That the reason he wasn't really resurrected because he never really died in the first place. Any doctor who reads the account of what happened would laugh at that and does laugh at that. I mean, there's so much confirmation. First of all, if you just know, like the scourging, for example, if you ever see the cat of 9 tails they would use at the time, how be ripping the flesh off and everything that he went through, plus the nature of crucifixion itself, plus you've got these professional Roman soldiers who their own lives would be forfeit if they didn't fulfill the execution, plus the fact that when it talks about they stabbed him, the water and the blood flowed out, is a sign that he had inflammation around his heart. We can look now through modern medical science and know exactly what that was. And so he was dead. He was very, 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 very dead, and that's very well confirmed.
That's why they didn't break his legs as well.
Exactly, because he didn't need to. And understand that's another confirmation they knew he was dead, because the whole reason they would break their legs. Again, I don't know how much you know about crucifixion. You die by suffocation. All right, because what happens is when your arms are out. All right. When you let gravity go down, so you're being held up by your wrist or whatever, you have trouble breathing. You can't breathe. And so then you have to push yourself up in order to get in a position where you can breathe again. But keep in mind, you're pushing yourself up on a nail that's driven through your feet. That's painful. You can't do it for very long. And so then you sag back down, but now you can't breathe. So now you get up again, but now you're in pain. And eventually you suffocate. Well, the reason they would break the legs is they wanted to hasten it so you would die quicker. They break your legs so you can't push up. But they didn't do that for Jesus. Why? Because they knew he was dead already. He was already dead. Right.
Many people examine that.
Yes, the idea that Jesus didn't die is laughable. And like I say, you're not going to see that in scholarly circles, but if you're ever on the internet, frankly, you see even dumber things on the internet, but that's a big one, okay? All right, and the third thing you do, so how do you prepare? You practice, you engage, and you evaluate. Now, I'm going to give you a very easy methodology to evaluate yourself, and it's this. When you go back, after you have a conversation, you go back, think of these 3 skills and use that as your framework for evaluating. So when I had this conversation with so-and-so, did I have the knowledge that was necessary to respond to whatever their claim was? Yes or no? If I didn't, okay, now I know where I need to work on, all right? Did I have the wisdom? Did I manage the conversation correctly? Did I use the questions, or did I kind of jump in when I shouldn't have and then allowed them to? Remember we talked about how sometimes the professors ploy where they'll try to shift the burden of proof onto you? Well, did you let someone do that? And that's so you're evaluating how the conversation went there. And then number 3, and this is the one where I'll be honest that most of us probably fall down on the most, and this is what, Adrian, you were picking up on way back when we watched the Polyev, the Canadian Prime Minister candidate video. It's like, did we demonstrate a character that was consistent with the message we were communicating? If you're not polite, you're not humble, you're not respectful, then it doesn't matter what you do if you have the knowledge and you have the wisdom, all right? They're not listening to you because they think you're a jerk. All right, so that gives you the framework for evaluating, all right, how you did on a conversation after the fact. All right, now, to help you out more with this, what we're going to do, you can use leading questions, not just to guide people to certain points of knowledge that you want them to get to, certain facts you want them to get to, but you can also use leading questions to help illustrate, frankly, flaws in their own reasoning, when they just make basic logical mistakes. Do you need to have a PhD in philosophy to do that?
No.
I mean, it helps, but no, you don't. I don't have a PhD in philosophy. I do have a minor in philosophy in my BA, and I went to law school where they teach you to do this stuff as well. But no, you don't need to. And so, I know it's going to be a short class tonight, but that's what we're going to do next week. All right. Next week, I'm going to illustrate for you the most common logical errors that people make in conversation. All right. Going to show you how to recognize them, give you some easy cues to remember them. All right. Show you how to recognize them easily and how to respond to them using the Columbo method. All right. And that'll be our last class. I know. We will, just so you know, in January. Like I said, January 17th Pastor Jay will be leading the workshop on Thanksgiving and what it means to be giving thanks to God, all right? And then on the following Wednesday, the 24th, Lori Hinman will start teaching a class. It's called Location, Location, Location. And it's going to be all about different locations in the Bible. And you can be walking through basically the geography of Israel and what happened at this particular location, the significance of this location versus that location.
In December or January?
January. Did I say December? No.
No, you didn't say it.
Okay, January. So that will start the first well after next week's the last well, where we have the meal and everything. And then I should mention that the 13th of December, we are having a service, a midweek worship service at 6:30, where if by some chance you like to hear me talk, I am delivering the message that night. Don't ask me what it's about. I haven't written it yet. And then we'll be off until January 17th.